Hello and welcome to the Mindful Millionaire Show. I'm your host, Lisa Peterson, and today I am interviewing my friend, Jonathan Fields. Jonathan has been an incredible source of inspiration and support over the years, along with his wife, Stephanie, and I'm really excited to be sharing his latest book with you, Sparked, and we're talking about the journey of how that book came together, what he has learned about himself through the assessment, and also what I've learned as a sage slash maker with an anti-spark type of nurturer. So you'll have to dig into the conversation to hear about what we've both learned about ourselves and how it can make us better leaders, better team members, better partners. I am just loving this conversation, and I hope you do too. Jonathan, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's always great to be hanging out with you.
I'm very pleased about this conversation, and you have a new book out, and I always like talking about books and things that people read, which seem to be not as popular as like YouTube and podcasts and those sorts of things. So when you still write a book, and we want people to really dive into reading. That's something that I know you really focus on a lot, because in the podcast that you have a lot of authors. And I'm really curious, even just from that thought, like, are people still reading books?
Yeah, sadly, I don't think nearly as much as they used to. I do a ton because, like you said, I interview a lot of authors, and I know you interview a whole bunch of people who write books also. And I also, because I'm a writer, I just have a passion for the written word, and so there's something about it where I'm always reading other writers because, in part because I might want to learn what they have to offer, but also often just because I want to see how they approach the craft. But that's, I'm an odd bird. I think for the most part, the consumption cycle for most people has been so accelerated. And then the bandwidth and attentional capacity over the last couple of years, given the state of the world, has dropped dramatically. The old joke used to be that the average human being as an adult has the attention span of a goldfish. And now I'm not sure where we go from there, but I'm pretty sure that it's greatly diminished from that. But I do see people being interested in long form deep dives, but they're shifting the way that they're doing it. But I haven't given up on the form of a book yet. To me, there's still something sacred about it. And maybe I'm just sort of like, a Gen Xer who's holding on for dear life to the book form. But I'm okay with that if that's even sort of like the real basis for me, like still wanting to read and write a lot of books.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because I hadn't even thought of asking you this, but I do feel like even the book that you just wrote is very different than books that you've written in the past. And I can even see how, shorter sections and exploring topics that people can explore in a short period of time. I'm just kind of thinking about that. And was that on purpose, or do you think it just happened because of the type of book you wrote?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of both. I mean, I think what we're really notice is that people want to be able to just digest information, especially because this is it's a prescriptive book. It's not sort of like a fiction book where you just get lost in the story. You get lost in a lot of smaller stories that you relate to. So part of it was an acknowledgement of the fact that people do consume, even when they consume a whole book, when they read a whole book, they tend to do it in bite-sized pieces. And then part of it is also just the nature of what, the material was all about, is it really lent itself to compartmentalization, is a weird way to say it. But it just fit that mold really well. So it was a pretty easy choice. I've written a bunch of books before, and I know you've written, and figuring out what the structure of a book is often a brutally hard process. And this one was actually really straightforward. Like, I knew from the beginning what it would be, and it didn't change a whole lot along the way, which is probably the first time that's happened to me. And it just kind of fit the ability to write in these discrete bursts of insight and stories. So it actually made it really a lot easier to write, to be honest with you, than a whole lot of other books.
Oh, that's interesting, because I was hanging out with you more, I think, when this was a seed in your mind and you were playing with these ideas. But take us back, because this book that you've written, and I have it here so I can hold it up, Sparked, is an assessment book. I mean, it starts with an assessment. And I don't even know if you planned originally that, oh, this is a great idea, I'm going to write a book about it. But there was a seed. And I'd love to know maybe time frame of when that seed happened. And then what was the next step after that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of seeds along the way. And I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, when did this, because the book is based on an entire body of work, which is really asking the question, um, how do I find and do work that is deeply meaningful to me, that fills me with purpose, that gives me access to flow, that lets me feel fully expressed? And I've been obsessed with that question for pretty much my entire adult life. But when I was tracking it back, I think the really early seeds of this particular question were probably planted for me around 9/11. Until very recently, I was a lifelong New Yorker, was there in the city during 9/11, knew somebody who went to work and didn't come home that day, was very successful. It didn't change anything. And, of course, thousands of people didn't come home that day. And being in the city, sort of witnessing what happened all around me. The day before, and this story, I had actually signed a 6-year lease for a floor in a building, to open what I hoped would become one of the premier yoga centers in New York City. And I woke up the next day to 9/11. So I had a lot of questions spinning in my head. One was, who did I know, who wasn't with us anymore? And the other big question was, am I really going to say yes to launching a business into what was then just a sea of profound suffering, and uncertainty, just dramatic uncertainty? And there are a lot of interesting parallels to the last couple of years, in odd ways. And through really thinking about what happened to the people that I knew that didn't come home that day, and the decisions I wanted to make, I decided that it was important for me to say yes to doing something that I knew would fill me up and also potentially really be of service to a broader community. But the seeds, the questioning really got a lot deeper during that season of my life, because I came face to face with the fact that we only have one pass through, and we have no promises made to us. And, to the extent that we have control over the way that we get to spend our days, I wanted to figure out, how do I make decisions? What do I say yes and no to that will make me feel most alive? That would be most meaningful in my time that I have here. And that seed has just kind of brewed and shown up in a lot of different ways. It literally fueled a lot of the yoga that I taught for 7 years. It then fueled the launch of businesses and books and brands, and Good Life Project, which is actually celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year, which kind of blows me away. Was, definitely an outgrowth of that too. And it's really been in the last 5 years or so that I've started to devote a lot more energy to the narrower question, of identifying work that fills us up, that, makes us come alive. And can I figure out how to build tools that would really help people in that quest? Because there's a lot of great work out there, but there were specific questions that I wasn't seeing answered. And I want to go deep into those questions. So it's been kind of an evolutionary process with a couple of particular moments that have dotted it along the way that really sort of, shifted my course a little bit.
And when you came out with the assessment, uh, were you surprised at how many people leaned in and took the quiz?
Yeah, I was blown away. I mean, as we have this conversation, we're closing in on about 650,000 people who've completed the assessment, generating close to 35 million data points. So, heading into 2018, I was asking this question: is there an identifiable set of impulses that all human beings have that would make them invest effort, sometimes a ton of effort, work really, really hard for no other reason than the feeling it gave them? Maybe you get paid for that, maybe you get well paid for that, but that's actually not the reason that you do it. And I didn't know if there was an answer to that question. And I started to deconstruct and sort of every job and role and industry that I could find. And as it distilled down to these 10 impulses, and then I realized that there were certain tendencies, preferences, and behaviors that wrapped around each one of these impulses to form archetypes, which I ended up calling Sparketypes. I wanted to build tools but the tools were so I started looking at developing an assessment, but it was really for two reasons. One was to deepen into the research because I had a lot of anecdotal evidence and stories from people that I was sharing the work that I was doing with and saying, and they were reflecting back to me how both accurate and useful it was. But I wanted to see if there was validation at scale. So we actually developed the assessment for that reason, but also because I knew that if we could build something that was useful and valid and then just share it with the world, it could make a really big difference in a lot of people's lives. So we spent the entirety of 2018 developing the assessment, the Sparketype assessment. And yeah, when we finally rolled it out of beta at the very end of the year, I could not believe the reception that we got. I mean, and I think it's a testament to the level of um, unhappiness that so many people have, both curiosity, but also discontent that so many people have with that thing that they're doing that consumes most of their waking hours, that we call work. And the excitement about a possible tool that could help them answer some questions that they've had about themselves and the way they work for sometimes for decades. But yeah, if you had told me that I'd be sitting here having this conversation with you in 2022, and pretty good shot that we'll cross over 1 million people at some point this year having completed the assessment, I would probably laugh at you. But the momentum just keeps growing faster and faster around it. And in no small part also because the last few years, if people weren't asking the existential questions, then they are now. So this is, I certainly did not anticipate what we're in the middle of these days, but it's a body of work that I think is really helpful for this particular moment in time also.
Yeah, you mentioned flow and flow state. And I remember a story that you shared that was really touching to me at Camp GLP when you pulled out this guitar that you had just made. And the the connection, that I later figured out reading the book and taking the assessment was around you being a maker. And I'd love it if when you are in your maker mode, my assumption is that that's a flow state for you. And I think it's really helpful if you could share maybe a little bit about that story of the guitar, but also how it relates to the book.
Yeah. So one of the Sparketypes, which happens to be mine, is called the maker. And the impulse for a maker is to make ideas manifest. It's all about the process of creation. And these impulses tend to be a part of us from the earliest days, and they stay with us for life. So this showed up, as a little kid, with me just building everything that I could build, from taking bike parts and duct taping them together and making Franken bikes and riding them around the neighborhood. When I was in college, I spent my summers painting and renovating houses. I started building companies when I was in college, actually. So I built and sold my first small business when I was in college. Um, and then as an adult, that became a series of companies and then brands and then books and then experiences. And um, but a couple of years back, I started to realize that my creative impulse was being expressed largely in the digital and experiential domains, which is awesome. It's a great thing. But I started to realize that for me, sort of like the highest form of my maker work comes when I'm working with physical materials, when I'm like with my hands on physical materials. There's just something about it that I'm drawn to. Um, and I've also been a lifelong lover of guitars. I'm not a good guitar player, but there's something about the form. I've been playing my whole life, and there's something about the form of an acoustic guitar that's kind of mesmerizing to me. So a couple of years back, I actually took a month off and I went out to this rural, renovated roadhouse in the middle of farm country in Pennsylvania and worked side by side with a luthier or a guitar builder. And I learned to build a guitar like side by side, 13 hours a day. And it was like I'd wake up at 8 in the morning, I'd go down to the workshop and I would blink and it was 9 p.m. I completely and utterly lost track of time. My body was physically exhausted because it's like physical work doing this. But I was maybe the happiest I've been in so long. And I didn't think about anything else. I wasn't checking my devices. I wasn't sort of like wondering about how my business was going. I knew it was taken care of. I was completely and utterly absorbed in the experience. And that was really, really powerful because it brought me back to the fact that this is who I am, I'm capable of feeling this way. I wasn't stressed. I wasn't, I wasn't burned out, even though I was working really, really hard. Um, I just felt like I was doing the thing I was here to do, not necessarily building a guitar, but i- immersing myself in the creative process, working with physical materials. It was a really powerful reminder to me that I need to go back to that space. I need to cycle back to it. So I came back and, you saw actually the first time I had ever played the guitar that I built publicly, and the entire time I was shaking with anxiety because A, like I said, I'm a terrible guitar player, and B, this was in front of like 450 people. Um, I'm an even worse singer. And C, I know how like little glue there is in certain parts of that guitar, and I was hoping that it just wouldn't spontaneously combust on stage while I was playing it. Thankfully, we made it through the experience, but it was a really powerful reminder to me that I need to go back to that place on a regular basis, and that the feeling that it gave me when I was there is really important to me, and I think it's really important for everybody to find ways to sort of like touch back into that space.
Yeah. Well, it really speaks to me probably because I'm sage first and then maker second. Maybe could talk
Mm.
about how that lays out. But you made me think about the fact that when I was a kid, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I would build these carnivals in our backyard. Like I would imagine what they look like when you go to a carnival, and I would try to build these games and things that were happening in our backyard, and then I would go and try and beg kids to come, and like play the games. And so it makes me think, yeah, I've had this all the way back. And when I first started my company and people would show up for something, I got that feeling that wasn't really completed back when I was a kid, of like, I built all this stuff and hardly anyone would come. And so when people show up to things, I get so excited because not only have I created something, now I get to share it with others, which is a big part. And maybe that ties into Sage. But could you describe how those pieces come together when you take an assessment?
Yeah. So when you take the assessment, you learn three things at the end of it. What we call your primary Sparketype, your shadow Sparketype, and your anti-Sparketype. So your primary, you can think of as your strongest impulse for work that makes you come alive. Your shadow is not shadow as in the Jungian, version of it, but it's really sort of like your runner-up, your next strongest impulse. It's the impulse that lives in the shadow of your primary. And very often there's this more nuanced relationship, which is that you enjoy doing the work. You're often very good and skilled at it because you do it a lot, but you'll also tend to do it in service of doing the work of your primary at a higher level. And then there's the anti-Sparketype, and that's on the opposite end of the spectrum. That's the type of work that tends to be the heaviest lift for you. It tends to empty you the most and require the greatest recovery. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you never have to do it or you get to opt out of it. It may be part of your job, or it may be a part of a role. Like if your primary devotion is a parent, and that is your quote work, and your anti-Sparketype is the nurturer, which is one of the Sparketypes, and that's all about lifting people up, giving care, elevating them. Um, it may mean that for some reason that like we don't understand, it's a bit of a heavier lift for you, but you also care deeply about your child and your family, and you have values that you really want to be of service to them and help them. So you're going to like be there and nurture, um, for a whole bunch of other reasons, and that's going to make you feel good too. But you're also probably going to need to take care of yourself and recover a little bit more and really invest in self-care a little bit more than somebody else, simply because that's the way you're wired. And that's sort of like an important thing to know. Your pairing of on the primary and shadow, the sage and the maker, is interesting. And I've seen you do this now. Like we've known each other for a while. So the impulse for the sage is to awaken insight. It's all about illumination. And I know that you like that is your favorite thing. When you share what you know and you see the lights go on in other people's eyes, it's like there's nothing better for you. Like you're giddy when that happens. So that's your primary impulse. And then the maker, my sense is it shows up for you, because you get to create these experiences. You get to build the structure and the scaffolding around the experiences that then lay the foundation and set the table to awaken insight. So those two impulses tend to work really well together. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, yeah, completely. And even when I described earlier, the fact that it was just like you said, I'm making in service of the breakthrough, which is different than how you described your situation with the maker being in the top in that number one spot. So the other piece that's really funny, and I shared a little bit offline, is I have this nurture as the anti-spark type. And when I have to say it was really liberating because I can't even begin to tell you all the synapses that were connecting when I got to that stage. At first, I was irritated because I'm like, I nurture, right? How dare this report say I don't nurture? But when I calmed down and I started looking at like even the partner that I picked in life, right? My life partner, Tim, he is a total nurturer. And early on in our relationship, I think it even goes to the core of I didn't think I could be a good parent. And I said, I don't want to have children. Like, I don't think I have that gene in me. And I think it has to do with this, right? Anti-nurturer. And he's like, we kind of broke up over it. And ultimately, I had to be like, I'll have one child, if that's the only way. And later in life, sure enough, when we had children, I really deferred to him in the nurturing role. I did what I needed to do, but there was all these things that he took over, and he's so good at it. But what also is helpful to hear this and kind of just be comfortable with this realization is that not only did I pick a great partner, but also that it's okay that I don't have to fulfill that role. There are plenty of people, even people inside of my business, coaches that help out that are similar to me, but they're more nurturers than I am. And so I'm like, okay, everything good. Now we're moving on, like, because I've done my nurturing. Now I just want you to have insights. And it's so beautiful because self-reflection and self-awareness, it's not that we're going to wake up and say, everything's perfect, I fit the mold. It's the acceptance of the fact that we don't have to fit the mold and that we are fine as we are. And that's what came through to me for this.
Yeah, I love that. And you're right. It's interesting because we were doing the work on the anti-Sparketype while I was writing the book, but we didn't have a lot of data on it because it wasn't a part of the assessment back then. I was literally calculating it by hand when I was working with clients with like corporate teams. And it was a small enough number of people that I could look at the raw data and then figure it out and then share it with them. And what I started to see was like these teams were lighting up, like senior leaders were looking at this and they're like, we want to know more about this. And I realized it was actually a really important piece of the puzzle, but we didn't have a ton of data and a ton of insight by the time that I actually finished writing the manuscript. As you know, you finish writing, like a long time before the book is actually out. And then since then, we actually, we expanded the algorithm behind the assessment to include the anti-Sparketype and launched the 2.0 version of the assessment beginning of 2021. So we have now, 150,000 or so new individuals who've completed it with that, millions more data points around it and tons of stories and use cases. And I got so much more insight about the anti-Sparketype now than I was even able to include in the book. But one of the things that tends to come up is when people do get either the nurturer or the advocate as their anti-Sparketype. The nurturer, people will sometimes ask, does that just mean I'm a bad person? Like I just don't care about anyone. It's like, no, of course not. You may like love a lot of people and really care about it, people or animals or whoever it may be. And it may be important. You may hold the value that it's actually really important to play the role of being there and lifting up. This is just telling you there's something about your wiring that makes it a bit of more of a lift than other things. So it's really good to know that and to forgive yourself also, and to know that when you're stepping into the role of doing it more intensely, you're also going to need to take care of yourself at a much higher level because it will be more depleting for you than for other people. So you're going to need to figure out ways to refill your tank when you do it. And similar when the advocate shows up in the role of the anti-Sparketype, some folks will ask me, well, does that let me off the hook? Like, do I not have to advocate for anything anymore? And I'm like, no, like there may be things in your life, there may be, like issues or ideas or people or communities that you care deeply about and you want to champion. And, it just means it may not come as easily to you and it may take a little bit more out of you to do it. So again, you may say yes to that work because for other reasons, for values-based reasons, but you also really need to take care of yourself along the way when you do it.
Yeah. The other realization I'm getting in this conversation about the nurturer is my kids are incredibly independent and self-sufficient. And I'm getting right now that like, okay, you got it. Great. You go take care of that over and over, right? Thousands of times as the parent probably has a lot to do with that style of kind of saying, okay, I did what I needed to, now you take care of yourself. And they're incredibly good at nurturing themselves to the point where I'm like, don't you need some extra help from me? And they're like, no, I'm good. But that's what we want as our children, right? We want them to have that kind of ability to know themselves. And so I'm just seeing some really cool things as a result of
Yeah, I
this.
mean, and I love how you're sort of like looking at, well, there's actually some really interesting positive things that have come out of really understanding how this has shown up in my life, and in the lives of my kids, and there's been a lot written over the last decade about sort of from Jess Leahy and Jonathan Haidt about helicopter parenting and coddling. And every parent wants a kid first and foremost to be safe, and then we want them to be happy. But sometimes in the name of safety, we stop them from making a single mistake. We protect them from anything that we think will go wrong. And in doing that, like we think that we're actually taking care of them, but we're actually removing the opportunity for them to develop the skill set of resilience, and then the joy of competence when they realize that they can move through something that either failed or was way harder than they thought it would be. It's a really fine line, but so I love that realization. It's like, yeah, there's actually um, there are benefits to all of these different things, and maybe you having more self-reliant, independent kids, like in some way, shape, or form, was a reflection of this.
Hmm. Yeah. And I mean, you wrote the book to help people better understand themselves, just like we're having right now. I mean, just conversations seem to be a really healthy way of you can read the book, but you're going to want to probably do more with it. I mean, what happens? Are you bringing people together to have these conversations? Are you encouraging that? Just curious.
Yeah, so it's interesting because that wasn't part of the original intention, but it's been reflected back to us so often now that here's this scenario, the email that we get on a regular basis. Hey, I bought the book. First I took the assessment. I loved it. It was spot on. So I bought the book because I had to dive in and know more about myself. And then I immediately, quote, made my partner take the assessment and then like read their chapters also. And, we've been together for 2 decades. We thought we had every conversation that there was to have. And then we sat down, we had this conversation that we'd never had before. We learned things about each other that we didn't know. And we had language to explain so much of why certain things came more easily to me and why certain things were really hard to me. And it created both like a deeper conversation and connection, and also in certain circumstances, forgiveness. Um, and so it's really been interesting to see how the body of work has sparked conversations that have nothing to do with the world of work, but really are just about like between people and how they show up in the world and helping people understand each other. And then work together more effectively, even if it has nothing to do with their jobs. If it's just the way that you run your household, the way that you parent, the way that you like show up volunteering around the neighborhood. It's really interesting to see, you create something that in your head has one purpose and one intention, and then you let it go into the world, and you really have at that point, it's like people will start um to tap it to do all sorts of different things. And so it's been amazing to hear all the different ways that people are sort of like applying the broader body of work, like the book itself, sure, but also just the body of work and the tools. It's been super cool to see. And people have been asking us about application, in institutions, in education, in relationships. So it's and we're thinking about, and we're actually developing programming for all the different domains, but we're sort of at the window of like doing things one at a time. So we're focusing a lot right now in organizations and leadership because it's really powerful application in that domain, especially now when companies don't want to lose their quote, the people they really care about. But a lot of people are re-examining whether they want to keep doing the job that they were doing 3 years ago. And this tool set allows people to have much more open, real, and honest conversations, and also give them the understanding of what actually is going right and what could be going better. And then instead of just saying, I need to blow things up and leave to start over, do a lot of reimagining and redesigning within the context of your own job or your team or your company, so that you actually don't have to make a bigger, more disruptive move. You can actually get so much more of what you need where you are once you understand what it is that you actually need. So it's been really fun to see all the different applications emerge.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of having my whole team do it. And now I'm like, oh, maybe if everyone on a team does it, would you start as simple as saying, this is what I am, these are the realizations that I've had, and kind of share that and begin the discussion of like any tips? Because I'm curious. I think a lot of people listening is like the people you work
Yeah.
with, spend so much
So
time with them.
what we do when we work with teams is we'll actually, because we have access to the data, and we'll do this with teams as large as like hundreds and hundreds of people in a global enterprise. We'll actually we'll analyze it, and then we'll present sort of like group insights. We'll present a group or a team Sparketype, which is really fascinating to see where the weighting is like really heavy in one type of impulse and really light in another. And it often explains so much of team dynamics, and also when things get stuck and when things flow really well. Because you can kind of see it. It's a really powerful diagnostic tool. In terms of facilitating these sparked conversations between team members, I always like to say first and foremost that before any conversation happens, psychological safety needs to happen. So that's always first and foremost. We need to understand how to create the psychological safety within a group or a team for people to actually feel comfortable having conversation, because not everyone is comfortable there and not every team has that safety. So it's really important to think about that before you deepen into this. And then when you sort of like you go through a process and you can cultivate that, then it tends to be really powerful and fun to sort of have people share their type, and then often just share, well, ask the question, well, tell me about a moment or an experience where you felt like you were really doing the work of your Sparketype in the past, and how did it make you feel? What were you doing? Where were you? Who were you with? And how did it make you feel? And you can actually go through the primary, the shadow, and the anti. And it can be both a really fun exercise and also a super valuable exercise in terms of really enhancing team dynamics and getting understanding between people. But again, it's a type of thing where I was like, you got to do the work to create the safety first, and also give permission to people to opt into or opt out of that conversation, not mandate that everybody has to do this thing.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I even think, because I run coaching programs and I'm always looking right now, the big thing that I have seen is people want, the business skills or the money skills, but what the conversations more often are going towards, because as you know, I want the whole person. I don't just want the business, right? I want the personal stuff, and I want the feelings, and I want that to be safe. This would also be a potential tool in those masterminding groups so that we
Mm.
can get to know one another better. And when we're giving insight to one another, when you know where someone's coming from, it's like it becomes so much more powerful and helpful. Have you seen it used there too?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, we just a month ago, we just wrapped our first certification around this, where for helping professionals, whether it's coaches or internal leaders or educators or even therapists, we're part of the group. So yeah, we're seeing it used in sort of groups and coaching experiences across a lot of different domains. And it's really fun to see how people are weaving, either using it as sort of like standalone process, or just integrating the tools in the body of work into, like the tools in the body of work that they already have, and sort of like finding a place for where like there's this, there's just a way to either facilitate conversation, or it answers another, puzzle piece in what we're doing that just helps us understand ourselves a little bit better, and why we make the decisions that we make. So for sure, we're seeing it show up there in a really big way.
That's so fun. I love talking about that. So what's next for you?
Continuing with this, I mean, I find myself, as we have this conversation, I'm running two companies right now. Good Life Project, which is a media company, which is, as I mentioned, we're celebrating a decade. And now Spark Endeavors, which is the company that houses all of the intellectual property and the programming and the research behind all the Sparketypes. So what's next for me is continuing to just host awesome conversations on the podcast. And we have some new shows that we're developing that will be out in relatively short order, actually. And Spark Endeavors, building the management team so that it's beyond me, so that everything is sustainable. We're in, we're effectively running a startup now, which can be all consuming on its own, especially with the pace that we're growing and the body of work is getting exposure. So I'm sort of I'm backfilling the foundation a little bit right now, as often happens when you're in a startup. And the course of this year, like we'll really start to team up in a way that will support the growth and the demand that we're seeing around what's happening with it. So, and then I'm hanging out, with my family in Colorado and trying to sneak in as many snow days as humanly possible before it goes away.
That's awesome. Such a fun conversation. And so next steps for people, what can they do? They can go and take the assessment and obviously get the book. And you're going to want to get the book if you take the assessment, but what's the best step?
Yeah, I mean, I think just that really, the assessment is freely available online for everybody. So just go check it out. If it, it'll take you about probably 15 minutes to complete. It'll ask you to think. So be prepared to, like not zip through it in 3 minutes, but actually think a little bit. And if the results resonate with you, then you can go deeper into the body of work. And I hope it will.
Yeah. And where do they get the assessment?
So that's just at sparketype.com, SPARKETYPE.com. And even if you forget the E in the middle, which people often do, you will still end up in the right place.
That's good. That's smart. No, that's so fun. And, the last question I have for you is just about mindfulness. And I know we're both longtime meditators, and I'm really on the soapbox right now. So I'm inviting you to come onto that soapbox with me in these times that we're living in. Any thoughts about how important mindfulness is when the world feels very uncertain?
Yeah, it's critical for me. The when when the world feels groundless and the stakes rise, and that is exactly the moment that so many of us are in right now. When the world is groundless and the stakes are low, nobody really cares. It's not a big deal. It's like you're reading a thriller where there's a lot of uncertainty, but your personal stakes are not. It's really low. It's the time you're investing in reading the book. It's the stakes of the protagonist in the book that's really high. But when you become the protagonist and you're in the thriller and the uncertainty is sky high and the stakes are sky high, it can have a devastating effect on our psyche and then our physical body. And one of the, mindfulness to me, I've had a practice for way longer than now, going back to about 2010. It started because I was brought to my knees. I didn't want to actually start the practice. I was in a dark space and I needed something to latch onto, to touch stone again. And what started as a practice that helped me just come back to baseline, and not be spinning and anxious and suffering every day, has turned into a practice that allows me to just move through my life, move through the different seasons, whether it's calm and peaceful and grounded and relatively low stakes, or whether it's, massively disruptive and uncertain and huge stakes, to sort of not take the radical swings as I move through those and experience them and acknowledge there are things happening in the world, some of which I have control over and some of which I don't, but to the word that Buddhists use, like one of the four measurables, is equanimity, you know, but it's a little bit, my understanding of the translation is it's equanimity based on wisdom. And it's a really important distinction, because equanimity based on ignorance is one way to get to that same space, but it doesn't have the same effect. And what I feel like mindfulness gives us is greater and more regular access to equanimity based in wisdom, and based in just observation, and based in the ability to just come back to what is and discern what's real and what's the story that we're spinning in our heads, and just keep coming back to the present moment. And also very often see what's right and see what's good in the moment, which we sometimes don't have access to when we're spinning out in the future. So for me, it's been, it's something that I do every morning. And I don't ever see a moment where I'll stop that practice.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for being here and for this conversation and for writing your new book. I hope everyone checks it out and goes and takes the assessment.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's always so much fun.